In 1863, a government geologist filed a report that most people have never heard of, and it quietly overturned everything mining companies thought they knew about the Great Lakes. If a story like that catches your attention, hit subscribe right now, because this one only gets stranger from here, and I don't want you to miss where it ends up. The man behind that report was Charles Whittlesey, a geologist who spent years surveying the copper country around Lake Superior for the federal government. His job sounds simple on paper. Go document what mining companies were finding as they opened up new operations across Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the 1840s and 1850s. Nobody expected his notes to turn into one of the strangest unresolved puzzles in North American history. At the time, prospectors believed they had found virgin territory, one of the last untouched mineral frontiers left on the continent. Geological surveys confirmed something rare. The Lake Superior region held some of the richest deposits of native copper on Earth, meaning the metal existed in pure form, not locked inside ore that needed smelting. Investors poured money into the region, convinced they were the first humans to ever touch this copper. They were wrong, and it didn't take long to figure that out. As mining crews cleared land and dug new shafts, they kept running into something they hadn't planned for. Old pits, dozens of them, then hundreds, then thousands, scattered across the Keweenaw Peninsula and the islands of northern Lake Superior, including Isle Royale. Some were shallow depressions, barely visible under a century of forest growth. Others dropped many feet into the ground, with walls cut cleanly enough to surprise trained engineers. In several places, full-grown trees stood rooted directly inside these old pits, their roots wrapped around broken rock that had clearly been disturbed long before that tree ever started growing. Whatever had happened here, it happened a very long time ago. What made this even harder to dismiss was how widespread it was. This wasn't one strange hole found by one confused mining crew. Different companies, working in different locations, often with no communication between them, kept reporting the same kinds of features. Trenches following copper veins precisely, drainage channels cut to keep water out of the workings, waste rock piled in patterns that looked organized rather than random. This wasn't the leftover mess of a few people poking around for loose nuggets. It looked like real, sustained mining. Then came the tools. Stone hammers started turning up everywhere, sometimes still lying exactly where they'd been dropped beside an exposed copper vein centuries earlier. Most were carved from extremely hard volcanic rock, shaped to be gripped comfortably in the hand and worn smooth from repeated use. Some were light enough to swing all day. Others were so heavy that using one for any length of time would have required serious physical effort. Archaeologists would eventually catalog thousands of these hammerstones across the region. For the engineers finding them in the 1800s, the obvious question was simple. If people were mining with tools like this, who were they, and how did they organize something on this scale? The answer to how they worked the rock came from another discovery, evidence of a technique called fire setting. Long before explosives existed, ancient miners built large fires directly against exposed rock faces, letting the stone heat for hours before dousing it suddenly with cold water. The shock of that temperature change cracked the rock, allowing large sections of copper to be pried loose using nothing more advanced than stone tools. This wasn't guesswork or luck. Fire setting takes real understanding, how different types of rock respond to heat, how long to let a fire burn, when to cool it, and how fast. It's a technique that was independently developed by ancient mining cultures in parts of Europe and the Near East, and now the evidence showed it had been used here too, on the shores of Lake Superior. The story shifted again once researchers were able to date the wood preserved inside these old mine shafts. Timber supports recovered from several sites turned out to be roughly 3,000 years old. Some samples were dated even older. That places this mining activity long before the Roman Empire, long before Norse ships ever reached North America, and thousands of years before any European colonization began. At that point, there was no longer a real argument about whether these mines were ancient. The mystery had shifted onto a much bigger question. If people had been pulling copper out of this ground for thousands of years, where did all of it actually go? By the time Whittlesey finished his survey in the 1860s, the scale of what had been removed was hard to ignore. His estimate put the total amount of ancient copper extraction somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds. Modern researchers view that number with real skepticism, and many argue it's likely too high given the limits of 19th century measurement methods. But even the far more conservative modern estimates still land in the hundreds of millions of pounds range. However you adjust the number, you're still looking at an operation that ran for a very long time and produced an enormous amount of metal. It's worth going back to how all of this actually came to light in the first place, because the discovery itself is almost as strange as the mystery it uncovered. In the winter of 1847, a mining agent named Samuel Knapp was surveying land near the Ontonagon River in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He noticed something odd about the ground, a long, continuous depression running across the landscape, visible even under 3 feet of snow because the snow itself had settled into the shape of the sunken earth beneath it. Knapp suspected it marked a mineral vein and decided to dig. What he found underneath stopped him cold. Buried inside one of these old pits was a massive slab of pure native copper, roughly 10 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and nearly 2 feet thick, eventually estimated to weigh somewhere between 6 and 7.5 tons. It hadn't just been sitting there. Someone had lifted it several feet off the bottom of the pit and rested it on a support structure built from oak logs. The copper itself had been hammered smooth on its surface. This wasn't a natural boulder that happened to be lying in a hole. It was a deliberately extracted, partially processed mass of metal that ancient miners had managed to lift and support, using nothing but timber and raw physical effort, and then, for reasons nobody has ever explained, left behind. Knapp's discovery led directly to the opening of what became known as the Minnesota Mine, which for several years in the 1850s was the most productive copper mine in the entire country, built essentially on top of a mining operation that predated it by thousands of years. And Knapp's find wasn't an isolated fluke either. Decades earlier, in 1743, an English traveler named Alexander Henry had already written about encountering a massive boulder of pure copper along the Ontonagon River, describing how he personally cut a 100-pound chunk off of it with an axe. That same boulder, known today as the Ontonagon boulder, was eventually hauled away and shipped to the Smithsonian Institution in the 1840s, where it remains on display, a nearly 4,000-pound piece of native copper that had clearly been chipped away at by human hands long before Henry ever laid eyes on it. Put these pieces together, and a pattern starts to emerge that goes well beyond a handful of curious pits in the woods. Archaeologists now estimate that evidence of this ancient mining activity stretches across roughly 150 miles of the Upper Peninsula, spanning Keweenaw, Houghton, and Ontonagon counties, and continuing onto Isle Royale, out in the lake itself. Some researchers studying the region have referred to the people behind this activity as part of what's sometimes called the Old Copper Culture, a broad term used for ancient Great Lakes communities who worked native copper into tools and ornaments over an extraordinarily long stretch of time. Evidence for copper toolmaking in this region reaches back roughly 7,000 years, making it one of the oldest known metalworking traditions anywhere in the world, well before metallurgy developed independently in most other parts of the globe. That alone is a detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves. While much of the ancient world was still working exclusively in stone and bone, communities around Lake Superior had already figured out how to identify, extract, and shape metal. None of this required smelting, which is part of what makes the Lake Superior deposit so unusual in the first place. Because the copper here occurs in its pure metallic form rather than bound up in ore, it could be cold worked or gently heated and hammered into shape without the complex furnace technology that other ancient cultures needed to develop before they could use metal at all. That single geological quirk, pure native copper sitting close enough to the surface to reach with stone tools and fire, may be one of the simplest explanations for why mining activity here grew to the scale it did, and why it continued for so many centuries. Copper artifacts from this era do exist across North America, and some of them are genuinely beautiful. Tools, fish hooks, spear points, awls, ornaments, and ceremonial pieces have been found from the Great Lakes down through the Mississippi Valley, showing that copper was traded and valued across a wide network of ancient communities. But when you add up every recovered artifact from every known site, the total is a small fraction of what appears to have come out of the ground at Lake Superior. The math doesn't balance. If hundreds of millions of pounds of copper were mined, where is the rest of it? There are a few reasonable explanations on the table. Some of it was likely melted down and reworked repeatedly across generations, the way metal often gets recycled and reshaped rather than preserved in its original form. Some of it probably moved through trade networks that archaeologists haven't fully mapped yet, passed hand to hand across a continent with no written records to track it. And then there's a more provocative possibility that some researchers have raised, that a portion of this copper may have traveled much farther than the Great Lakes region. That idea has kept this story interesting for well over a century, because answering it means figuring out not just where the copper went, but who had the organization and the transportation capable of moving that much metal in the first place. This is where the story crosses the Atlantic, at least in the eyes of some researchers. During the European Bronze Age, massive quantities of bronze were produced for tools, weapons, and trade, and bronze is made primarily from copper and tin. For decades, some archaeologists have debated whether Europe's known copper sources alone were enough to explain the sheer volume of bronze that shows up in the archaeological record during that period. It's worth being clear here that this remains a genuinely contested idea within archaeology, not something broadly accepted as fact. Modern isotopic analysis, a technique that studies the chemical fingerprint locked inside copper based on the specific geology it formed in, has been used to compare artifacts found in Europe against known ore sources around the world, including Lake Superior. Some studies have reported similarities worth investigating further, Other researchers strongly disagree with those interpretations and argue the evidence isn't nearly conclusive enough to support a transatlantic copper trade. No broad academic consensus exists on this question, and it's important to say that plainly rather than pretend it's settled. What isn't in dispute is the core fact underneath all of it. The ancient mines were real, the copper was extracted at a massive scale, and a significant amount of it has never been accounted for. There's also the question of how this copper moved once it left the ground, even setting aside the more speculative transatlantic theories. Long before European contact, native copper from this region has turned up in archaeological sites hundreds and even thousands of miles away, carried along river systems and portage routes connecting Lake Superior to the Mississippi River watershed. Traders could have moved copper by canoe down the Ontonagon River, across smaller waterways, and eventually into trade networks stretching across a huge portion of the continent. This kind of long-distance exchange is well documented in the archaeological record through the copper artifacts themselves, found at burial sites and settlements far removed from the Upper Peninsula. It shows that even without any connection to Europe at all, this copper was valuable enough, and these networks organized enough, to move raw material and finished goods across an enormous stretch of ancient North America. That alone helps explain where some of the missing copper went, even if it doesn't account for all of it. Modern researchers studying this region today rely on a very different toolkit than Whittlesey had access to in the 1860s. Instead of walking the shoreline with a notebook, archaeologists now use ground-penetrating radar to map pits without disturbing the soil, radiocarbon dating to pin down timber ages with far more precision than early estimates allowed, and geochemical analysis to study the copper itself down to its trace mineral content. Even with all of that added precision, the fundamental questions Whittlesey raised more than 160 years ago haven't been fully resolved. If anything, better tools have mostly sharpened the questions rather than closed them, giving researchers more confidence in how old the mines are and how much copper came out of them, while leaving the biggest question, where that copper actually ended up. Just as open as it was when Knapp first cleared the snow off that strange depression in the ground back in 1847. A completely different kind of evidence entered the picture, not from a geologist this time, but from the oral history of the people who had lived alongside these mines for generations before any survey crew ever arrived. In 1894, the Wisconsin Historical Society published a collection of oral traditions recorded from Ojibwe elders, families whose connection to the Lake Superior region stretched back countless generations. Among those recorded accounts was a story that has drawn steady attention from researchers interested in the ancient copper mines ever since. The elders weren't describing the discovery of the mines. They were describing the people who had once worked them. According to the tradition, strangers arrived from across the water, traveling in large vessels. They weren't remembered as wandering explorers stumbling across copper by accident. They were remembered as organized groups who already seemed to know exactly where to look. They went straight to the deposits, extracted what they came for, and eventually carried it back to the water. Whether this account preserves a literal historical memory passed down with precision, or a tradition reshaped and reinterpreted across many generations before it was finally written down, is something historians still debate honestly. What makes it worth taking seriously is how closely certain details line up with archaeological evidence that had already been documented completely independently long before anyone recorded this oral account. The elders described fire being used to break apart solid rock before copper was removed, and archaeologists had already identified burned rock, ash deposits, and fracture patterns inside the mine workings that matched exactly that method. The tradition also described copper being carried from inland mining sites toward the shoreline for loading onto vessels, and it's a documented fact that many of the largest ancient mining sites sit remarkably close to the shores of Lake Superior and Isle Royale. None of this proves every detail of the account is a literal record of history, but it does show real, striking overlap between an oral tradition and physical evidence gathered through completely separate methods. Maybe the most interesting part of the account is how it ends, because there's no dramatic conflict, no disaster, no sudden vanishing. The elders simply remembered that after many years of work, the strangers loaded the last of the copper onto their vessels and left, heading back out across the water in the direction they'd originally come from. And then, according to the tradition, the lake grew quiet again. That memory apparently survived through generations of oral history before it was finally set down in writing in 1894. In date its own, that account doesn't answer every open question about the ancient mines, but placed next to everything else, thousands of documented pits, the hammerstones, the fire-setting evidence, and an amount of extracted copper that still doesn't fully add up, it becomes one more piece sitting inside a much larger, unfinished puzzle. More than a century and a half has now passed since Whittlesey first walked this shoreline, documenting what mining companies were digging up. In that time, archaeology has changed dramatically. Radiocarbon dating lets researchers pin down the age of ancient timber with real precision. Geological analysis has traced exactly how and when this native copper formed, long before any human presence in North America. Every generation of researchers has brought better tools and sharper methods to the site, and yet the central mystery hasn't really moved. Nobody seriously disputes that these mines are ancient anymore. Thousands of prehistoric excavation pits have been documented and mapped across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale. Thousands of stone hammers have been recovered, many still resting beside the copper veins where they were last set down. Fire-setting evidence continues to show up wherever researchers look closely enough. That part of the story is settled and well studied. And the unanswered part starts right after that. Who organized mining on this scale, sustained across centuries? How did the knowledge of fire setting get developed here, and how was it passed down accurately enough to keep working for generation after generation? How many people, over how long a stretch of time, actually worked these deposits? And still, after everything, where did the missing copper go? Even trimming the highest 19th century estimates way down, you're still left with a volume of extracted metal that demanded serious planning, organized labor, and some form of transportation network to move it anywhere useful. This is exactly why the 1894 Ojibwe account keeps getting revisited by people looking into this mystery. Not because it proves any single theory, it doesn't, and treating it that way would be unfair to the tradition itself. Oral history carries memory forward across generations in its own way, and like any historical source, it has to be weighed alongside archaeology, geology, and everything else we know, not treated as a standalone answer. What makes it worth including in this story is simple. It describes a group of people who came specifically for copper, who already knew where to find it, who used a mining method that matches what archaeologists independently found underground, and who eventually left by the same route they arrived on. Whether that reflects a precise historical memory or a tradition reworked over centuries before it reached paper is a genuinely open question, and that openness is part of what keeps this story alive. Look at the different pieces on their own, and you get a clearer sense of how this whole picture was actually assembled. The archaeological record preserves the mines themselves, physical, datable, still sitting in the ground. Whittlesey's 19th century survey preserves the observations of the first trained outsiders to examine them and take the sites seriously. The Ojibwe oral tradition preserves a memory of the people believed to have worked them, carried forward long before anyone thought to write it down. None of these three sources tells the whole story by itself. History rarely gets solved by one clean discovery. It usually comes together slowly, one old report, one careful excavation, one recorded tradition at a time, each one filling in a little more of a picture nobody has completed yet. It's entirely possible future excavations around Lake Superior will turn up evidence that reshapes parts of this story we currently take for granted. It's possible improvements in isotopic analysis or dating methods will eventually settle the transatlantic copper debate one way or the other. And it's also possible that some pieces of this story are already gone for good, preserved only in fragments scattered across old government reports, museum shelves, and the oral histories that were fortunate enough to be recorded before they were lost. Whatever the eventual answer turns out to be, one fact isn't up for debate. Long before American mining companies ever reached the shores of Lake Superior, long before Whittlesey filed his federal report, and long before that 1894 account was ever written down, someone was already mining copper here, at a scale that still challenges easy explanation. Who those miners really were, exactly how their operation was organized, and where that enormous volume of copper ultimately ended up, remain some of the most genuinely open questions in North American archaeology. It's also worth mentioning Isle Royale specifically, because it adds another layer to this story that's easy to overlook. The island sits well out into Lake Superior, isolated enough that reaching it at all would have required real skill in open water travel, not just casual paddling along a shoreline. Yet ancient pits and hammerstones show up there too, in numbers that suggest sustained, repeated visits rather than a single expedition. Whoever was working the mainland deposits was also crossing open, unpredictable water to reach a remote island, extracting copper there as well, and presumably hauling it back across the same lake. That detail alone tells you something about the confidence and capability of whoever was behind this operation. This wasn't a small group testing the waters near shore. It was an operation willing to push out onto one of the most dangerous bodies of fresh water on the planet, again and again, because the copper on that island was worth the risk. There's something worth sitting with in how this whole story keeps circling back to the same handful of details, no matter which source you're looking at. A geologist walking the shoreline in the 1860s, and elders recalling a tradition passed down over generations, ended up describing pieces of the same picture: fire against rock, copper moving toward the water, an operation too organized to be accidental. They arrived at those details through completely different means, one through measurement and excavation, the other through memory carried across time, and yet they land in roughly the same place. That kind of overlap between independent sources doesn't happen often in archaeology, and it's part of why this particular mystery is held up as one of the more genuinely compelling unresolved questions in North American history. rather than fading into a footnote. If stories like this, ones that dig through old government records, real archaeology, and oral history rather than easy answers, are the kind of thing you enjoy, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, I want to know what you think. Who do you believe the Ojibwe elders were remembering when they spoke of the strangers who came for the copper? And where do you think all that missing metal actually ended up? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every one of them.